Hello, this is Alex, not my real name, and I want to do a short video. Um, this is my message to parents in the 21st century who have heard probably a lot on their television set in the form of commercials. There's some advertisements running now about depression hurts and such medication helps or makes it not hurt so much. And there's certainly a lot of controversy currently among like educators and advocates for children and whatnot, because they're concerned about young people being put on these medications. We know now, at least we think we know, every time and again, I like to remind people in these videos that I am a person who was treated by doctors, some of the better doctors probably in the state that I live in, and they were really ineffectual, and it was counterproductive to even be introduced to them. And I, on the other hand, I'm an ex-drug addict, ex-alcoholic, and I live at my mother's house, and I'm 32 years old, and I have no formal training as far as medicine or pharmacology. So just keep that in mind. I'm just talking about what has happened to me. But I do want to talk about my experience with psychiatrists, because what my parents did is when they got divorced, I kind of went off on my own. I was 14 years old, and I thought I'll be fine, you know. And I guess I was fine for a while, but when I went off to college, I sort of developed some anxiety problems, and they kind of got worse. And I thought at the time, it was mid-late 90s, that the person I should contact is not my father or my mother, but I should go to a therapist who sent me to a psychiatrist. And from there, it just sort of went haywire, honestly. And I'm 32 years old today, and I'm talking to you, and this is my warning to you. When I first went in, I had anxiety, so I wasn't all that comfortable. A lot of my anxiety stemmed from, or certainly was made worse for when my dad abandoned my family. And so I wasn't all that comfortable with older male figures, especially a certain kind of older male. And my doctor kind of fit that description. So when I went to see him, I wasn't really keen on taking drugs, what I call hard drugs, to differentiate them from street drugs. So hard drugs are synonymous for they're the term I use to describe psychiatric medication. So I wasn't keen on taking hard drugs, but I figured, they're on the cover of Time magazine, and they've cured depression, and they've cured anxiety and all this, and so I should just take my medicine like a diabetic takes insulin. So I started on what are the weaker drugs, Prozac first, and it really didn't help. It made me quite a bit worse, but I was anxious, and I wasn't all that comfortable with the prescribing doctor, and I couldn't really articulate that I didn't feel better, except that I said I didn't feel better. I didn't really make it clear that I was feeling worse. So we just moved down the line. He said, well, it can take time. So I was then in Zoloft, I think next, Celexa at this time. And it just got worse. So my doctor then said, well, he started thinking, maybe you don't have just typical depression or anxiety, maybe you have a more severe problem. So he put me on a whole range of medications, like a mood stabilizer called Depakote, and antipsychotic medications, which are intended to treat psychotic conditions. He put me on Zyprexa, which I had a horrible time with. During this time, I really fell off the face of the earth as far as my functioning went. I, for 2 years, did not see anybody socially other than my first-order relatives. I had trouble sleeping, sexual dysfunction. just sort of all sorts of bizarre behavior, and some, my thinking just got very messed up, and it was like almost my own mind was terrorizing me, and for the doctors this was evidence that I needed more and more drugs, and I thought, well, they must be right. It turned out, though, that my psychiatrist was under the influence of drugs himself, and he was caught and disciplined by the board in my state. His license was suspended but stayed, and as he sort of got back to sober, he realized, I guess, that I was on too much medication, and he dropped all that other stuff and just left me on an antidepressant called Lexapro and a anti-anxiety agent, a benzodiazepine called Klonopin. Klonopin is generally not recommended for, it's not used as a daily medication indefinitely for a number of reasons, but it wasn't my case. And I became addicted to it. I didn't know it was a controlled substance, though it is one, but I would definitely know if I missed a dose. Fast forward a few years and when I was about 25, things had really, from about 18 when I started on medication to when I was 25, my whole life had been a disaster. I'd started drinking heavily, and it had become a problem in my life. And I wasn't sure that the medications I was on were helping me, so I talked to my doctor about stopping them, and he thought that would be insane. And so he gave me a sort of a protocol to get off. I was taking 6 milligrams of Klonopin a day, which is a very high dose, and 10 or 20 milligrams of Lexapro, which is not that high. And he just told me to stop taking the Lexapro, just discontinue it, and to reduce the Klonopin by a milligram a week. So take 6 milligrams. 6 weeks to get off of it. And this was disastrous. And I started drinking alcohol every day to cope with the horrific withdrawal that I went through. I could not walk under my own power because I couldn't support my body weight on my legs. So I would crawl to the restroom, things like that. But then with all the drinking, they sent me to they said, "My lord, you're an alcoholic. You should go to rehab." So I went into rehab and got met with a psychiatrist there, and I was in such bad shape. I was in withdrawal, and so they raised the Klonopin from 2 milligrams, which is all I could get down to. I never got fully off of it, up to 3, and put me back on an antidepressant. And they thought, well, he should really be on an antipsychotic. So they sent me to, so there was a psychiatrist there at this rehab, dual diagnosis facility. They sent me to an evaluator to have psychological evaluation, which took all day, or most of the day. And, they should ink blots and do that kind of stuff, and they come up with a diagnosis. Well, they didn't come up with any kind of psychotic diagnosis for me. They came up with a personality disorder. That was one of the most alarming thing, I suppose. It was called avoidant personality disorder, depression, and anxiety. And the lady who was doing it, her name was Antoinette Cicerella at the time. She even said to me at one point, "I don't know why I'm testing you for this stuff," because they wanted to rule out Asperger's syndrome and schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, autism. These are pretty severe diagnoses, and I clearly don't have those. But at the time, I was in such a bad way with the withdrawal that they thought I did. And they never considered or contemplated the fact that I had been rapidly reduced after many years on a very high dose of a benzo and completely dropped from a serotonin drug. So the second psychiatrist, he brought me into his office, and they put me on a schizophrenic dose. So he contacted my first doctor, and they in collaboration with each other, I guess decided that I must have a psychotic disorder, and that the psychologist was just wrong, even though she spoke with me for 6 hours or 5 hours or whatever it was. So I got back to a second trip with her to do another round of testing and more questionnaires and stuff like that. And this time she decided that I still didn't have any of those other things, she changed my personality disorder to one that was a little more appropriate to what they wanted my personality disorder to be, which was, she said I was schizotypal personality disorder. But very wishy-washy in the text about how there was no diagnosis based on my responses. But if she had to choose, and she would happily choose the one that would allow them to experiment with antipsychotics, which is what they were eager to do. So they put me then on Seroquel, a schizophrenic type dose, close to 1,000 milligrams, which is nothing quite like being on 1,000 milligrams of Seroquel, at least not for ice cream cravings. And at this time, I was very confused, because all these smart doctors, they were telling me that I was had schizoaffective disorder, basically, and that so this doctor at the dual diagnosis rehab I was at, we sat down in a room, and he just flat out told me that I would never, I needed to accept that I was not likely to ever be able to have a self-sufficient life, able to support myself or work or things like that, that I would basically be, because of my mental illness, I would be unable to support myself. And this was really hard to hear, and I stayed in that place, that rehab, for several months. So by the time I left, I was thoroughly convinced. I didn't have a lot of alternate viewpoints in my ear, and like I said, my parents had been divorced, and I didn't have a lot of parental support. And so between 18 and 25, I just sort of spiraled out of control, really, ever since I started on hard drugs, psychiatric medication. And so by the time I left, I was pretty convinced that I guess they were right. I'm an alcoholic, and I'll never be able to accomplish anything in life. Unfortunately, I ended up in another rehab after being switched around and put on some more psychiatric drugs. Excuse me. And what happened here is there was no psychiatrist. They just said that some of your drugs, the Klonopin, the benzo, the one that I had tried to taper off of from 6 milligrams to 0 milligrams in 6 weeks, and ended up unable to walk. Well, they just took me off that cold turkey, and it just destroyed me psychologically. And 10 months later or so, I attempted suicide and ended up dealing with a new psychiatrist. And I was in this clinic in Houston. And again, at this point, I was thoroughly confused, defeated, and beaten, so I was just going to do whatever it was advised that I do. And I had a psychiatrist who was very inexperienced. And again, she dropped all my medications, gave no contemplation to the idea that the withdrawal or the sudden discontinuation of the benzodiazepine that I'd taken for so long could have had any role in my deterioration. And she put me on a new cocktail of an antidepressant, a very potent one that I would advise everyone. Parents, keep your kids off Effexor. Stay away. In my experience, I'm going to give you a real quick bit of advice. Even if you decide you want to take medication, that unless you or your child is literally on the brink of suicide, I would avoid at all costs. And this is just my free advice based on my experience. I would avoid at all costs regular dosings of the benzos, Klonopin, Valium, etc., Ativan, Xanax. Don't get on those daily. And when it comes to the antidepressants, avoid Paxil, avoid Effexor, avoid Cymbalta, but especially Effexor and Paxil. And finally, don't take antipsychotics unless you're psychotic. If you're not hearing voices, don't take them because you're depressed. I can't stress that enough based on my experience. So when I left this place, the psychiatric clinic, on a whole new batch of medications, back to my doctor, the one who was the drug addict who misdiagnosed me way back when. Things went very poorly. I told him I was going to get off the medication, and he gave me again too fast of a tapering schedule. I sort of didn't pay attention, and I just doubled his. He said, "Okay, get off of it in a month." I said, "Okay, well, I'll take 2 months," because what did I know? I just figured he's been really aggressive, so I'll be conservative. But I didn't know that he was completely, didn't know what he was doing, and was being reckless, really, based on my history of having these really hard withdrawals. So after 2 months, I was just in a really bad spot. The one thing I tried to do is something that I had done to cope really since I was 21, which was to drink alcohol. And to my surprise, I found out that I didn't like it. And I'd said this before to a number of people, that before I was 21, before I got put on hard drugs, psychiatric medication, I didn't care for the effects of alcohol. All my high school friends, when they later found out that I went to rehab for alcoholism, were stunned because I hated alcohol. And we would go out to drink. You know, I'd have nurse a beer and dump it out in the bushes, or have 3 beers and throw up all night. And it was a bit of a joke that I wasn't a drinker, didn't like it, didn't care for it, and couldn't handle it, which was all true. So the fact that I turned out as an alcoholic who had been to multiple rehabs was a shocker. When I stopped taking serotonin-affecting drugs, I found my alcoholic cravings basically disappeared. I tried to deal with the withdrawal sometimes by drinking alcohol, and found that the euphoric effects of alcohol had subsided. I was back to being 18, 17. So I was shocked. I had been really convinced that I was an alcoholic. So I drank, a whole bunch of times to sort of test this, and the alcohol, the euphoria of the alcohol that I experienced in my 20s that caused me to drink alcoholically, to drink 10, 15, 20 drinks in a sitting, it just never happened again. I had about 20 times where I tried to drink to test this, and I would struggle to finish 1 or 2 drinks. Most of the time I'd end up not even finishing a beer, and because I didn't like the effect. And it turned out now it's been 20 months since I've stopped taking antidepressants and antipsychotics, and even my psychiatrist, who sent me to a grand total of 5 rehabs, including a mental hospital that treats substance abuse, now is in full agreement that I don't have a substance abuse disorder. I'm not sure he would agree that it was a side effect of the medication. He believes in the miracle of remission, I suppose, but I don't want to speculate on actually what he thinks, but he would agree that I'm not an alcoholic. I don't drink because I take benzos, and I'm trying to take care of my health because my health isn't that good. But I will occasionally experiment with alcohol, and I had 1/2 of an alcoholic beverage a few weeks ago. So anyway, if you're out there, my experience over 14 years cost my family, my parents, and my insurance company over $250,000. It cost me my reputation, the years of my youth. I'm just strictly speaking about the alcohol and drug side effect here, not any of the other damage that's been done to my body. But so I just want to share that experience with you if you're considering, because it's not the type of thing you're likely to hear from too many people, and people aren't maybe even likely to believe me, but that is what happened to me. So I'm going to sign off here, and I hope if you're watching this video, it'll give you a little pause to sort of think outside the box and think for yourself, and sort of get past the ads you see on TV and in magazines and start thinking about, could it really be that simple? Do complicated problems really have solutions that come in a little pill? And because in my experience, I've said this before, but I don't really have any regrets in my life, except the fact that I got started in the racket that's the current mental health system, and I turned to them for help, and you know, 5 rehabs, $250,000 later, I'm here in a palatial room in my mother's house. I'm 32 years old, and have a slew of minor health problems that add up to one rather significant health problem, and it's all the effect of almost 15 years of hardcore drugging at the hands of doctors, clinics, hospitals, recovery centers, pharmaceutical companies, and they fleeced me for a lot of money, and in exchange they sold me a lot of hope that they could help me, and it turns out a lot of, but probably about 90% or more of my problem was the result of buying the hope. So keep that in mind, and you know, I'm going to sign off. This is Alex.